Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a virtual book launch hosted by the Regent College Bookstore at Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And today we'll be discussing the new book, Sarah's Laughter, Doubt, Tears, and Christian Hope, with the author, Dr. Vinoth Ramachandra. Regent College Bookstore is a not-for-profit ministry wholly owned by Regent College. The book and this book today, hopefully you can see that, is available to purchase at the link that I think will be at the bottom of your screen, and all sales support the ongoing ministry of the college. Well, my name is Rhonda McEwen, and I serve on faculty here at Regent as Associate Professor of Education and Culture and also Director of Regent Exchange. And it's my privilege today to introduce Dr. Ramachandra. Born in Colombo, Sri Lanka, where he currently resides, Dr. Ramachandra holds both a BS and a PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of London. And as an Anglican lay theologian, writer, teacher, and human rights advocate, he combines these multiple interests with his international work with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, IFES, serving on the senior leadership team as the Secretary for Dialogue and Social Engagement. Dr. Ramachandra is deeply committed to integral mission and transformational development, and also holds roles with the Micah Network and Arosha. He's the author of numerous essays, articles, books, including The Message of Mission, Faiths in Conflict, and Subverting Global Myths, Theology and the Public Issues Shaping Our World, along with many, many others. But it's this latest book, Sarah's Laughter, Doubt, Tears, and Christian Hope, that really is the reason for bringing us here today. And so the way this next hour will go is that we'll have a time of conversation together with Dr. Vinoth, but then we'd also invite you as our viewers to submit questions via the link at the bottom of your screen. Questions at regent-college.edu. And we'll be sure to leave a portion of time at the toward the end of our time for the author to respond directly to these questions. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Vinoth, and let's begin. Good. Well, let's start with a basic question. Why this book, and why now?
Well, thank you, Rhonda. Well, Lament has been part of my life, I guess. Even before I became a Christian, I was deeply troubled by the economic inequalities that I saw around me. And then when I did become a Christian and started seriously reading the Bible, I found that God too lamented over his creation and even expressed anger, outrage, that there was so much wickedness and innocent suffering, which was not what he intended for his creation. So I often have spoken on the subject of lament and suffering, but it was only in the last 5 years when my wife developed cancer and eventually died of cancer that I guess lament became more intensely personal. I wasn't just lamenting over the state of the world and the state of the church, but it became deeply personal. Mm-hmm. And as I began to give more and more talks on the subject of grief, dealing with grief and lament, people said, we hear so little about this in our churches. Why don't you write your talks, write a book on the subject? Now, there were academic books on lament, but very few that I thought were available for thoughtful lay people in our churches. And that's why I decided, okay, I will then expand some of my talks and turn them into a book.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that. But yeah, we were just talking about how you had shared that this book is really written for people who struggle with doubt, pain, the loss of hope, and the questions that pastors and theologians typically evade. And then in the book, especially as you start framing it at the beginning, you really lament the virtual disappearance of lament from our churches, and saying that it actually encourages dishonesty in our relationship with God and with one another. So I'd love to hear you speak to that a little bit. Yeah, what have you seen from your experience, and what does that mean? Maybe unpack that a bit.
Yes, well, lament is essentially our verbalizing pain, whether it's our personal pain or the pain that we experience in empathy with others who are suffering. And so it's really an honest way of speaking to God. We are clinging to God, even as we accuse God of being uncaring or indifferent or perhaps even unjust. And so lament is a way of keeping a conversation with God going, even as we navigate through those dark and desolate places in our lives. And we're not encouraged to do that in our churches, where we're often told that as Christians we should always be joyful, happy. We don't express anger towards God. We don't bring the pain of the world into our worship. And so worship often becomes a form of escapism rather than what it should be, and that is actually facing the realities around us and saying nothing that we experience, whether it's bereavement or divorce or conflict or unemployment, none of these things should be banned from their expression in the church. So basically that's what I'm trying to communicate.
Yeah, no, very, very powerful. And I'm just thinking, even in our present season, if there were, especially in I think North America, where we in the Western church, where we often don't really give much time for lament at all, as you pointed out. It seems like we're in a season where lament should be on our lips, and I'm wondering what some of your thoughts are in terms of how we can learn to lament well in the face not only of COVID-19 and what this virus has wrought, but also just in the midst of really societal upheaval on every front in our present age. And I'd love to, just hear some thoughts on that, and maybe what you've gleaned or learned from the global church at large that might help us in some of our local churches, wherever we may be.
Yes, I find that the churches in which lament is expressed are churches that are longing for a different world order. And it's the churches that are comfortable with the status quo, who benefit from the status quo, whether it's the political or economic status quo. They're the churches that do not lament. So lament is also an expression of hope, because we are, in a sense, straddling two worlds. We're speaking to God while being present in this world that is, in a sense, under God's judgment, but we are also participating in the new world that has been birthed with the resurrection of Christ, but which is not yet. And so as we weep and as we struggle and as we yearn for that new world, we express the cries of the psalmist. Why, Lord, do you seem to be absent? Or how long, Lord, do we have to continue in this situation? And those are the prayers that are constantly found on the lips of the psalmist in what are called the Psalms of Lament. The two questions: why, O Lord, are you delaying, or why are you absent? And how long do we have to endure the cruelties that the wicked heap on us, the injustice for which there seems to be no redress? So it's the churches that actually are longing for the kingdom of God, who pray as Jesus called us to pray: may your kingdom come, and may your will be done on earth, because his will is not being done on earth. So, and yet there is so much bad popular theology around that sort of says, well, God is going to protect and deliver all Christians from disease, from war, make their lives comfortable. I mean, there's this teaching that's around, taking texts out of their context and sort of developing sermons based on them. And so I think there's a lot of pretense that passes for authentic spirituality in our churches. And so the call for lament is, in a sense, the call to be honest, the call to be genuine, and to say, look, everything is not well, even within the church. And we need to be more sincere in articulating that. So what we read in Scripture does not match our everyday experience. And so we live in that tension between what we say we believe and the world as we experience it. And I think it's when we hold that tension creatively that our beliefs are actually deepened and our understanding of God begins to grow. And so that's why I think Christians and churches that are not willing to live in that creative tension are doomed to just, preaching dogmas all the time. They become fundamentalist. Or they go to the other extreme, which is to just dispense with traditional belief altogether and to let our experiences dictate to us. And then we end up sort of just drifting with the world, and we have nothing distinctive to say to the world. So I think holding that creative tension is what faithfulness in times like this actually comes down to, living in the darkness with questions perhaps more than answers.
Yeah, that's really rich, just learning to embrace the questions and sit with the questions. And I think I think later in your book you talk about the idea of how Christians live within this Holy Saturday, kind of this in-betweenness of anticipating the resurrection and yet recognizing that all is not what it should be or could be. I appreciated what you said about how lament is almost like a spiritual practice. It's not just this emotion that one feels only personally, on the death of one's loved one or something personally significant, but it's this opportunity to enter in to the darkness of others and to share the suffering with others around the world. I'd love to hear even just a little bit more of that, this kind of collective notion of lament, especially perhaps for those of us in more affluent contexts, where perhaps our churches have folks experiencing kind of personal pain, but on a very selective level. And yet, what does that look like to enter into some of the collective suffering and injustice in the larger context of our cultures and of the world?
Well, I say in my book, I recount in my book how I think it was in 2012, I called on the Anglican Church to which I belong in Colombo, the Diocese of Colombo, to have a service of lament on our National Day of Independence. Because the traditional way that Independence Day is celebrated is through these, military marches, and the government wants to celebrate what they call the defeat of terrorism, that is the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka that lasted 30 years. And so it becomes a kind of nationalistic, gung-ho celebration, the victory of the army over people called terrorists. And I called on the church, and the church responded unanimously to have a service of lament, where we would publicly lament over all who lost their lives in the war, not just the soldiers, but all innocent civilians who were killed by yes, the guerrilla fighters, by suicide bombers, by the army, that it would be a day of national mourning rather than a day of celebration. And that really angered the government, who saw this as being sort of anti-patriotic. So lament, when it's done collectively, especially when we remember the suffering of those whom we are taught to call our enemies, is countercultural. It's politically very powerful, and it can effect political change. And that's what we experienced in Sri Lanka.
Wow, that's amazing, amazing, and just really a powerful example of lament as like you say, a tool for change. Earlier you were talking about this idea of doubt, and that's actually part of the subtitle is the doubt piece. And I was also struck where you say that robust theological development is born of doubt. Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that kind of doubt and the messy, I think you talk about messy theology as you kind of unpack, especially the story of Job in Scripture. And it seems to fly in the face of again, our tendency, especially in a lot of Western sort of theological notions, to have our categories and so on, and this kind of messiness and in-betweenness and doubt as an opportunity for really growth and deepening our understanding of God and even our understanding of Christian discipleship. Yeah, would love to hear you speak on that a little bit, this messy sort of theology and the role of doubt.
Yes, well, I'm just reminded of a friend of mine who told me how when he first came to India, he came from a fairly small town in America, and he was from a church that believed that everybody who didn't explicitly put their faith in Jesus was lost forever. So every non-Christian was eternally lost. And that was a theology that he was brought up in. And then he comes to India and he's surrounded every day by tens of thousands of people. He was just overwhelmed with the numbers, with the ancient cultural and religious traditions. And he found himself asking the question, do I really believe that all these people who through no fault of their own have never heard about Jesus are all just eternally lost? What kind of God is it if God is the creator of these people as well as one who has created me? And so then his traditional reading of certain selected texts in Scripture gets questioned. John 14:6 doesn't settle every question when it comes to how we relate to people of other faiths. How was Christ at work in these ancient cultures even before the first Christian missionaries came with the gospel? Was he known by different names? Can Christ be known and yet not be recognized as Christ? And are sometimes people who are not Christians be closer to Christ and his kingdom than people who loudly proclaim their Christian credentials? Now, these questions began to haunt him. And so then his theology became more messy. And then he realized that there are actually different ways of reading some of those scriptures and not just one particular way. And that there were many questions that will only be answered on the final day of judgment. And he realized, as he put it, that we are called not to be judges of others, but we are simply called to be witnesses, which is a very different metaphor. It is God who is the ultimate judge of human hearts. And it's God who decides who is in his kingdom and who is not. And Christ warned us about that and said there will be many surprises on the final day. But our calling is simply to be witnesses to the truth that we have discovered in Christ, and to present that truth faithfully, humbly, boldly, but not to make prior judgments on people's eternal destinies, and to be willing even to be surprised when we encounter faith amongst people who are not Christians. So that's one example, I guess, of how our theology expands as our life experiences grow and deepen. And we move with people who are very different to us and who come from very different backgrounds to us. So one of the problems with traditional Western theology is that it's been done in this sort of Western cultural, nominally Christian cocoon. And so that is why Western churches need to be also listening to people who have been living, I guess, for centuries in predominantly non-Western religious contexts.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, very, lots to chew on in terms of, just being very thought-provoking. I think later in your book, you say how mystery and paradox are at the heart of the gospel. And this idea of faith, being faithfulness in action than always just knowing all the right doctrines. Lots to chew on there. One of the things I really was curious hearing you talk more about is your chapter, which I found one of the most unique contributions in a book on lament, and that was looking at a natural evil. You talk about the phenomenon of natural evil, moving beyond the notion of grief and lament as only human loss. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, natural evil is used traditionally in two ways. People use it to refer to suffering in the animal kingdom, animal predation, animal extinction, animal death. And then a second sense is to do with what is misleadingly referred to as acts of God, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, floods, that sort of thing. And there is a strong stream in Western Christianity that attributes all these things to the fall. And I question that in my chapter. And I say, actually, there's nothing in the Bible as I read it that indicates that the fall, human fall, extended to the non-human creation. And it doesn't make sense scientifically either to refer to these as somehow abnormal or evil, or to say that there was no animal death or extinction until human beings appeared on the scene. That doesn't make scientific sense, but also biblically, it's not there. It's just something that we have unthinkingly sort of inherited. I think largely since the 16th century. Because when we look even at many of the early church fathers, they didn't attribute what they saw as death in the animal kingdom to sort of the fall of man. They celebrated the goodness of the non-human creation. And it's only with people like Calvin and Wesley and a few others that this thinking developed, that everything from inclement weather to fleas and caterpillars and parasites were all products of human fall. So I think we have to question that aspect of the Western Christian tradition.
And that's fascinating. And then even including that, as you talk about kind of these, the call for collective lament and bringing in some of the lamenting of creation and some of the challenges and evil and grief that we experience at the loss of creation, for sure. Just on that note,
evil is what we. I argue that evil is what we human beings do to the creation, and also a lot of the suffering that arises from earthquakes and floods and tsunamis can be traced to either human ignorance or human economic inequality. It's the poor who suffer most from these tragedies, and that's not God's intention.
Yeah. Yeah, in that you also talk quite a bit about, you have a chapter on the tears of God, and talking about how God in his relationship with creation, and Jesus as being in solidarity, if you will, of even the most forgotten victims. And so even in our conversion to Christ, you say at one point there can be no conversion to Christ that doesn't entail at the same time a conversion towards women, men, children at the bottom of our society. What does that look like in terms of, how does that work out in practice? Perhaps through Lament, but I'd love to hear just a little bit more on that. What a conversion to others who are at the bottom of society, what does that look like in Christian practice for those who may not be able to identify immediately?
Yes, it's interesting that one of the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount is, "Blessed are those who mourn." And I think Jesus is there speaking of mourning or lament as a distinct mark of his disciple community, because they are now sensitized, perhaps in a way that they were not before they became disciples. They are now sensitized to the ugliness of sin as it works its way into all human relationships, and the way that humans also relate to the non-human world. And so Christians are now people who are de-centered, less preoccupied with their own lives. They're turned outwards, and their eyes are open to see more of the misery and the pain and the tragedy of the world, and that should break our hearts. And then that moves us. Once our emotions and our imagination are changed, then that should move us into concrete actions on behalf of those people who suffer. So I think that's how I see the connection between mourning and lament, and actually specific kingdom actions. So as I think I quote Nicholas Walterstorff, who also lost his son in a mountaineering accident when he was, I think, 19 or 20, where he says, my eyes are filled with tears, and perhaps it's only through tears that we can see the world aright. So there is a sense in which the tears of grief do blind us, because we become focused on ourselves in those times of intense grief. But there's also a sense in which the tears clarify our vision, because now we're able to see things in the world that up till then we were just not aware of, not conscious of. And that's what a lot of people who've gone through grief will tell you, and that is, it's made them much more sensitive to the sufferings of others around them. It's made them softer people, so suffering can either harden our hearts, or they can soften and deepen us as people. Suffering does not leave us neutral.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. It's interesting. You also mentioned that, or you remind us really that the Psalms, I think so many of the Psalms are written in the collective, so that can almost serve as a model for Christians, to use, and certainly were a model to the nation of Israel. Have you seen other examples of this kind of collective sort of coming before the Lord. You know, you shared your example in Sri Lanka. What about at other churches, kind of using this model of collective lament to truly reflect and
Yes, I
enter
do give
into the
some
suffering?
examples. Yes, I do give some examples in my opening chapter of contemporary
Yes.
contemporary psalms of lament that various people from around the world have created to be used both individually but also collectively. And there are a lot, probably more in other languages than English, because English-speaking people generally come from the more affluent, more comfortable churches, which don't experience so much suffering. So some of the most moving poetry and music of lament comes from actually people using native languages in places where there's been natural disasters or war. Yeah. I was once at a East Asian Christian student conference, and I was very touched because they chose to spend a whole day of that 5-day conference in lament. And they just went country by country around East Asia, and they lamented for the politics of the country, the state of the church, the divisions of the church in the churches, the seeming irrelevance of so much church life, the suffering in those countries. And that was a very moving experience to have about 600 students from 9 or 10 different East Asian countries just grieving over the state of their nations. And bringing that grief to God in cries, sometimes not very articulate, but just crying to God to do something, to step in, to change things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I was quite struck even just with some of the sample examples. I think you have one from Nicaragua, another from a Sri Lankan Anglican clergyman in the first in your first chapter of your book of translated to English. And I was thinking even as I was reading them, just how powerful even somebody who maybe has not, even the part of the church that maybe has not experienced those same things, but to be able to share in some of the prayers and lament and cries to God with the global church, as you say, to be able to stand in solidarity and again give us that taste of what does it mean to enter in, as I think you phrase it, to the darkness of others, just as God has entered into that suffering with us.
And one third of the Psalms in the book of Psalms are Psalms of lament, combining, grief, protest, anger, and many of them are collective Psalms, or even the collective Psalms originated as personal Psalms of lament, and they can be taken and used in our churches and our Sunday worship. Psalm 88, which is perhaps the darkest of all the Psalms, is something that one can read with somebody going through depression, somebody with dementia, because there's a connection there between the darkness in which the psalmist is and the silence of God, and that conversation is still going on. Even though God is not mentioned, the conversation is there between the one uttering those words and the God who is silent but present.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. Well, I do want to encourage, if there's those of you who are watching that have any questions for Vinoth, we'd invite your questions. Again, it's just questions at regent-college.edu, and I have a few more, but we'd welcome anything that any of the viewers might have to send in. Well, one of the things that I was wondering was, you shared a little bit of just your own very personal experience of grief with the loss of your wife, and then certainly just with your years in working with countries throughout the world, especially those perhaps in the global south, and some of your work with students and various organizations. So you've certainly, this is certainly a topic that's been near and dear to your heart. But I'm curious, that they say, writing, the experience of writing can change us in certain ways. And is there anything that through the writing of this text and kind of putting, words to thoughts, is there anything that came out on the other side that maybe was a new insight, or something that it left you with, just an impression, that you would want to share?
I'm not sure. Certainly the writing itself is therapeutic, because you are expressing, you are articulating what's in your heart. And then as you read back what you've just written, it sort of reinforces those feelings, and often in a very healthy way, a very constructive way. It's a bit like music, I guess, because music both expresses what we feel, but music also shapes our emotions. And although I love music, I'm not a musician. I'm more a sort of a word craftsman. And I find when I look back over the words that I've written, I find they are also reshaping my emotions, even as they are expressing what's in my heart. It's a bit difficult to articulate, but I'm not sure whether there were new insights that came after I'd written the book. I think the insights came as I was writing and reworking the text, and I gave it to a couple of people to read, and they gave some feedback. So maybe all that went into the final product. And like I said, they originated, like most of my books have originated, in talks that I've given, lectures that I've given. And so I obviously will think of the responses that I got to the talks when I'm then putting them together in written form. So there is a dialogical process already there in the writing. Not only a dialogue with myself, but a dialogue with those past hearers whose words of critique or words of encouragement also have shaped my thinking.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thanks for sharing.
And I also think there's also remembered, I think the presence of my wife was there in a sense as I was writing, even though I wrote it after she died, because obviously things that she said to me echoed in my heart. And I sometimes may have thought, well, how would she have wanted me to say this? And and some of the things I say were things that I learned just by watching her going through that illness, and the tremendous courage that she showed during her illness. I was the one that was falling apart, but she had tremendous courage and was, prepared to die. And even just within, even as late as 2 weeks before she died, she was comforting and counseling other people who were sharing with her their own areas of pain, whether it was bereavement or divorce.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's it's a wonderful example of the things that you articulate toward the end of the book, and you talk about the future tense and this notion of hope. And I love the way you infuse this understanding of hope with so much depth and richness. I think sometimes, as you mentioned, we almost trivialize hope, or it's kind of somewhere out there. And you talk about hope in decidedly non-triumphalist terms, talking about hope as struggle, as vulnerable action, as a prophetic way of life, as waiting, and then hope in the darkness. yeah, I'd love to hear just maybe just some thoughts of your understanding of hope from that kind of theological perspective, and what that means, yeah, for us. I mean, you certainly still illustrated it with your wife, but would love to hear a little more on that.
Yes. Well, I do mention, I think, in that chapter, my favorite quotation on hope, which from a Sri Lankan theologian from the mid-20th century called D.T. Niles, who said, "Hope begins with the ruin of our expectations." And when I first read that or heard that, I think it was in the early 1980s, in the midst of the whole civil war in Sri Lanka, it struck me because we often confuse hope with expectation. We expect, yeah, the virus is going away, there'll be a vaccine next month. Or we expect, we hope the war is going to end. And we're saying we expect it to end for these reasons. But what if there is no vaccine? What if the war never ends? What if the political situation, in whether it's in the US or Canada, in my country, gets worse rather than better? What is it that we cling to? And I say, in the end of the day, we cling to the promise of God. That is the basis for our hope. And God has not promised that Sri Lanka or Canada or America are going to prosper. These countries don't even appear in the pages of Scripture. So it's not hope for my nation or my particular people, but it is hope that ultimately sin and death and evil will not have the last word. That God has triumphed over the worst evils, and the pledge of that, the promise of that, the beginnings of that is in the resurrection of Jesus, and that's what we cling to. And as we cling to that hope, we try to work for a better future.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, yeah, really powerful. And again, just yeah, in stark contrast to, even as we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, you kind of contrast that hope to not just this, somehow seeing that as a reversal of the cross or a cancellation of suffering, but yeah, something much deeper and richer.
Yes. Well, the resurrection is not the cancellation of the crucifixion, it's the vindication of the crucifixion. It's the way of saying it is the way of Jesus that led to the cross. That is the victorious way to live. That is what ultimately constitutes human fulfillment.
Yeah. Well, maybe another just kind of very simple, but something that I was curious about as I was reading your text is the title, Sarah's Laughter. And you mention it. You have this brief little note in a footnote, actually, about the Sarah's laughter, and you talk about the kind of the twofold sort of meaning of her laughter. But yeah, I'd love to hear you expand on that a little bit, and why Sarah's laughter for the title. What does that signify?
Well, I actually borrowed it from a quote from a German New Testament theologian of the last century called Ernst Käsemann, who said that Sarah's laughter is the other side of faith. And he was referring to the occasion when Sarah, eavesdropping on the conversation between her husband and the angel, where she's told that she will bear a child despite her old age, and then she laughs with skepticism, in scorn, in doubt. So that is the first occasion for her laughter. It's the laughter of doubt, of skepticism. concerning God's promise. But then later, when she bears the child of promise, she also laughs, and then it's the laughter of joy, the laughter of the promise fulfilled. And so what I suggest in that footnote that you referred to is that there can be no real Christian joy until we first experience that the laughter of doubt and even skepticism as to whether God's promises, whether the Christian faith actually is true and is relevant to the big questions and issues that we struggle with. And it's only as we begin to question that and probe it and explore it and walk with God through the valley of darkness that we can emerge on the other side and experience the joy of the promise fulfilled. So there is no shortcut to the joy of resurrection. We have to walk through the valley of doubt and perhaps even near despair.
Yeah, thank you. It strikes me that's just such an insightful kind of picture of for so many, even right now in our current cultural context, where
it's a very difficult thing to say. I mean, I find it very difficult because it goes against what is being told everywhere, and that is, like you mentioned earlier, Christian triumphalism. That, you know, we are victorious, we will not suffer, we will not go through tragedy, and God has not promised anywhere that we are going to be spared premature death. So it's a hard message, but to me it's what discipleship is all about.
Yeah,
it's walking the way of the cross.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we come, soon to the end of our time here, and I think again, if there's any last minute questions, I'd welcome those. But I'd also invite you, Vinoth, if you have any maybe any words or exhortations that you would want to leave with some of our viewers. And we have a number of leaders and Christian ministers, pastors that would be tuning in. Anything maybe in particular for them, or perhaps others, folks that are walking through a difficult time, or maybe know of others.
Well, I can't think of any. I just encourage you to read the book, and I'm more than willing to respond to any questions that people may have after they've read the book. Mm-hmm. Feel free to pass on my email address to them. There's also my blog, which you mentioned earlier, and I'm more than willing to get some feedback from people, both on the book itself as well as any similar experiences that they are going through and on which they are reflecting themselves theologically. Mm. So the conversation can continue even after this book launch has ended.
Thank you so much. That's a really generous offer. Yeah, I know this is coming at different time zones for many of you. So yeah, if you see this after the fact, that's a wonderful offer. And I really would commend this text to you. As I said, it's available at the Regent Bookstore. It's published by Langham Publishing. And I know for myself, I was just really struck with just the depth that is within these pages. I've read, it seems like books on lament or suffering tend to be sort of in two categories. One is in a very kind of devotional, just a very sort of devotional, but lighter kind of nature, or more sort of reflective, maybe autobiographical, or others that will be a little more analytical, trying to, unpack it from a theological standpoint, but it tends to be a little bit abstract. And, and Vinoth just brings, kind of this distinct position as a Sri Lankan Christian theologian, somebody who has, lived and ministered in context with immense suffering, with natural disasters and so on, and also brings that personal stance, and yet also in a very just rich, theologically deep, robust discussion of lament that certainly doesn't end with any easy answers, but one that I think is just incredibly helpful. So I would really commend this text to you and invite you to purchase it through the Regent bookstore. Well, thank you ever so much. Thank you so much, Vinoth, for joining us today.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
it's
and
my
thank
pleasure.
and thank you for those who've tuned in, either live or perhaps after the fact. We're just very grateful for your support of the Regent College Bookstore and also the ministry and work of Regent College. So again, thank you so much for tuning in, and have a good rest of the day wherever you may be.